Welcome to EMBARGOED, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today we have a very exciting guest. We have Chris Chamberlain from the law firm of Morrison and Foerster, but he was previously at BIS, where he worked on, focused on semiconductor export controls. So back in episode 55, Doug Jacobson and I talked about the new rules in October of 2022 relating to supercomputers and superchips. There were new ECCNs and new controls and prevention of diversion. And now, fast forward 3 years later, we've got Chris on the show to talk a little bit about kind of the history of that and where those export controls are today. But before we do that, first, welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. It's great to meet everyone.
Great to have you. And then we have two longtime guests of the pod, Melissa Burgess. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be back.
And Collmann Griffin. Welcome back, Collmann.
Hey, folks. Glad to be here.
Or as we sometimes refer to him, the clairvoyant Collmann Griffin. So we'll get to that at the end, where we'll talk about crystal ball and kind of what comes next, and maybe Collmann will give us some readings. But before we do that, why don't we turn it over to you a little bit, Chris, and you can talk about kind of how we got where we are now with respect to AI chips, and tell us a little bit about some of the history.
Yeah, great. I'm happy to. So, at this point, I think we would call it a famous or infamous speech that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave in I think it was around August of 2022, laying out this idea that in some domains we would no longer take the position that we had to stay, 2 or 3 generations ahead of China in this case, but that we should basically orient the rules to have as great an advantage as possible. And I think some people who are like deep in the industry picked up on that and thought, wonder what's coming. This certainly seems highly specific. And lo and behold, a few months later, they came out with what's now known as the October 7th rule. So it was October 7th, 2022. And it was a multidisciplinary effort to address various aspects of advanced computing and we'd say AI advantage from the perspective of export controls, at least addressing the export controls aspects of that. We talked a little bit about sort of what are the big lanes in that, and I think we'll get into this over the course of this podcast. But when we think about what did that set up? What did that do? And where have we come from there? There are really 4 lanes that I think of when I think of these rules. They were all in one rule, and then they have sort of split and become their own independent work streams. The big one that everyone thinks of is what we refer to as advanced compute. So this is AI chips, servers, modules, boards, items that are under the 3A090 and related ECCN families. There were also end-use controls on support for supercomputers. So these are items that are destined for a supercomputer, for example, in China. And then there was a second branch. I think of that as one major branch. So it's advanced compute, high performance compute, AI chip, supercomputer. And then on the other side we call it the tool rules, or like tools. And so this is really 2 different things. One is more popular or more well publicized controls on machine tools going to advanced fabs. That's the big one that most people will be familiar with. There were various entity listings and foreign direct product rules and footnotes and lots of complexity around where you can send machine tools to produce certain types of integrated circuits. But the other, a little bit less known, but I think equally important policy objective or channel or lane under that were a set of end-use controls around the support for production of so-called indigenous machine tools. And so collectively, and we'll get into more about this, like how do all these work together and what policy, I think, influence do they have on each other. All 4 of these are basically intended to restrict access to the most advanced compute resources and restrict access to the ability to make the most advanced compute resources. And I'm sure as we'll get into this, you really can't have one without the other. And if you can succeed in the latter, if you can succeed in being able to produce your own, becomes much less important whether you are restricted from acquiring the end items themselves. So yeah, I'll pause there, and we're happy to Melissa, if you have other comments, but we can get into how all of these work together.
Yeah. So the quick summary is, it sounds like in August 2022 there was maybe a hint of what was coming. But over the next 3 years and a month to this point, there was a lot of activity at BIS, and all focused on the thorny problem of, how do you solve the problem of AI? Perhaps a bit thornier than solving the problem of Maria. Over from that October 2022 rule through January of this year, so a 2.5-year period.
I would even say May. Actually, I think the last big waypoint was May, and we're waiting for the next one. Yeah.
But we had 7 interim final rules in that 2.5-year period, so ending temporarily with the release of the AI Diffusion Rule. And just kind of in terms of numbers and how complex the problem is, I think just a quick skim of the Federal Register gives us a good idea. That was about 250 pages, 3-column PDFs in the course of 2.5 years. And they're all interim final rules. So clearly it wasn't, we got this one solved. It was, okay, we're starting. And then, like the first anniversary, if you will, in October 2023, it went from 1 interim final rule to now we have 2. And everyone opened it with dismay of, oh my goodness, how long these are.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at. Like at that point, it was sort of team based, but there was a desire. Like one of the factors there was it became so complicated to deal with comments that came back on the rule, that some of which had absolutely nothing to do with each other. I mean, in the grand scheme they do, but areas where they're really specialized. And so at that point, it was a decision to we need to split these off so that we can channel comments to this Federal Register number and channel other comments to that Federal Register number and make it much easier. Not that BIS has yet responded to all of those comments, but at least that was the theory.
And I think these rules also, again, just at the very high level, they illustrate the thorniness of the problem in terms of some of them, we're focusing on kind of the traditional ways BIS amends the EAR. So we have, changes to the Commerce Control List. We have changes to license requirements. We have some new export license exceptions, perhaps a few more than we have in other areas. Foreign direct product rule, entity listings. And it wasn't really, in my opinion at least, it wasn't really to the AI Diffusion Rule where we got to kind of a major change, if you will, and that was essentially a kind of creation of a new country list. Not exactly, because it was kind of a country list without a country list, where we ended up with a few different tiers of countries, much to some countries' consternation, or perhaps almost every country's consternation. But, all of these, and this was, some of these kind of appeared day one, if you will, and then they were modified and modified again, and then, we need yet another license exception. So I think a lot of us on the outside, we look at this and it's kind of right over our heads of, we get it's a thorny problem, but.
Well, I can say I was struck at the outset from kind of the ambition of the project, right? Because essentially you've got to create new ECCNs, so new additions to the Commerce Control List, kind of that are designed to keep up with cutting edge technology. And so almost by definition, the day that you print these ECCNs, they're starting to become obsolete. And then new license exceptions that you've got to try and, gear towards behavior that you are hoping to exempt from these license exceptions. And then, as Melissa said, essentially a new country charter, a new set of controls that didn't exist before. And so you're kind of using groundbreaking export control rules, or at least using groundbreaking export controls to try and keep up with cutting edge technology. I mean, did you know going in that this project was going to be so ambitious and that it was going to kind of require these tweaks over the years to keep up? I mean, it seems like you did, but I'm just curious as to what people thought at the time and kind of as it progressed as to how big this challenge was and how hard it was to keep up.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So it's funny that you say that. I actually came to BIS under the Russia supplement, and I think Collmann and I thought, and then I discovered they had such a capable I had such a capable counterpart on that, and my skill set was not as heavily needed there. They had some other things they wanted help on, and so I got into semiconductors. But it is funny. When I was hired, I think it was like September, and they said, I said, well, I can't start until March. This was like 2023. And I think Eileen said, there are some things that we'd love to have your help on, but you start when it works for you. And I think like 2 weeks later, the October 7th rule came out. I was like, okay, I think I have an idea. I was like, I think I know what she was talking about.
This might be a lot of work.
Yeah. So I think it is absolutely accurate to say that this project set has really pushed BIS and the whole sort of federal apparatus really to the really go deep in terms of what are the rules capable of, what tools can we use. And I think each aspect of this has different, I would say, like different constraints or restrictions or like things that influence the rules to move in the direction that they did. And I think a couple of salient features are, number one, you have a situation where basically like a very small handful of companies, right? In the AI chip space, you have even a very small number of companies. In the tool space, you also have a very small relatively small number of companies, that are representing 90+% of the market. That makes it much easier in some cases to act with more precision and also leverage tools, mechanisms that I think are less common. So is-informed letters, letter authorizations, highly specific and targeted ECCN controls, for example. So I think like that feature of this problem set did have a significant influence on the mechanisms that BIS had available to it. But yeah, otherwise, I do think this problem set is really like a full suite illustration of what rules were available and what authorities were available. And then in some cases, there was a need to create new authorities, right? So this was not well publicized, but like for example, there's now the authority to do an FDP through is-informed, right? I mean, so it's like, what does the problem require, right? And so there was a lot of frequent grappling with, what can we bring to bear on this, and that included sometimes guidance that was published, guidance that was not published, using very intentional or unintentional use of preamble language, right, to signal and message certain things. So yeah, I think it's a very diverse representation of the tools that BIS had available to it.
So you mentioned FDP, the Foreign Direct Product Rule, and its role in kind of some of these new rules. It strikes me that a lot of the challenges here arise from the fact that much of the production is outside the United States of the items that you're trying to control, and generally export controls. I mean, the first fundamental rule is the EAR applied to items that are made in the United States. And so can you talk a little bit about the challenges posed by the fact that items were outside the U.S. and that you needed to use, that BIS needed to use things like the foreign direct product rules, different foreign direct product rules?
Yeah, so one of the things I had intended to mention in that last sort of survey, I think one of the most salient features of this is the role of, or the desire to have multilateral effect, and really accomplish controls that are effective in the sense that all the relevant items are controlled. And as consolidated as some aspects of the industry are, it is definitely a global industry. And so, there is that is a challenge, right? No country wants to cede its sovereignty and authority to sort of handle its own business, and that's fundamentally what the extraterritorials do. Is they say, well, we're going to extend our jurisdiction, outside the United States in ways that are very unusual, and I would say, antithetical in some ways to, how many countries see their authorities. That being said, I think this is an area where, this is not necessarily a solution in search of a problem. But I think like export controls are naturally inclined towards like protecting advantage. That is fundamentally what they do. Like they protect a technological advantage, and so I think that plays out here, right? So there's a lot of complexity in how you describe the rules and what do they apply to, but fundamentally they are grounded in very significant, I would say, like U.S. advantage or U.S. or close ally advantage in design tools. So these are like software products and technology that you would use to design advanced integrated circuits, and then machine tools. So these are this is semiconductor equipment, wafer fab equipment. These are areas where, with a few exceptions in specific areas, there's quite a significant proliferation or dominance or incidence of these tools in the most advanced fabs. And so when you think about like from a pure policy perspective, that's quite a strong backstop, against like a desire to not, a desire to not be subject to those rules, because those fabs and those designers, they have absolutely no interest, or maybe they do have an interest, but it would be very difficult, prohibitively difficult to, pull all U.S. tools out of the most advanced fabs in Taiwan and Korea, for example. So in that sense, they have a quite strong foundation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other tools that you all were using, that BIS was using, at least right from the start, was prohibitions on U.S. persons, which looked a lot like OFAC prohibitions. I mean, they've always been some in Part 746, but it seemed like that was another tool that you all were using to kind of rein in, technology that was either coming from a U.S. person or coming from a U.S. tool that had been exported.
Yeah, I actually think the use of U.S. person controls is really interesting, and now it's like the whole industry has gotten used to saying like, and if you have any U.S. persons involved, make sure you're doing due diligence for WMD, military intelligence, chemical, biological precursors, and semiconductors, right? It's like,
exactly.
It's like, what? The
right.
WMD and semiconductors, right?
Right. One of these
they don't fly in exactly the same way, but yeah, that was yeah.
So I guess I'll throw it out there. One of the things that I was struck by with the multilateral controls, because it did look like the new country list that Melissa was talking about was essentially trying to take countries or put countries into the good list based on whether they were having control, they had sufficient controls over semiconductors in a way that is kind of new. I mean, it basically created this good list of countries to which the license requirements wouldn't apply. In some ways, that was a unilateral control. I mean, I think the ECCN number has a 9 to start with, so it is a unilateral control, but very different than the anti-terrorism controls. I was wondering if the fact that Wassenaar right now is defunct kind of led the U.S. to go in that direction, or not defunct, but not as active as it used to be, led BIS to go in that direction of kind of unilateral controls to try and encourage a multilateral regime.
Yeah, I feel like with Collmann on, I probably don't have the best. I don't have on this call. I don't have the best perspective. So welcome your thoughts on that. But I guess I would just say like this agree in the sense that there was a very strong desire to have like an all tools approach to these problems. And again, I think recognizing the ability to leverage like deep consolidation in some aspects of this, that you don't need 42 countries, to have an effective plurilateral control. What you call that and what the mechanisms are, we could say for another day. But basically, yeah, I think that is that is illustrative. That was definitely talked about a lot. About why do some of the traditional mechanisms not work as well? But yeah, Collmann, what are your thoughts on that? I know this is.
No, I will just say that my understanding of, I mean, Tim, you're exactly right. I don't think Wassenaar is working that well these days. I don't think that's a secret. As everybody knows, it includes Russia, which is not going to be excited about any export controls. And then also, I think there is something I was picking up on, is that it's difficult to get a consensus with the whole Wassenaar group. That's a lot of countries involved, some of which are not these days not super aligned with U.S. interests. And Chris is the expert in all of this, but even I know that the supply chain, the supplier countries are much more consolidated than, not to pick on South Africa, but we don't really need South Africa involved in AI or semiconductor control tools.
I would make a comment. So it's clear. This is again like just simply reporting the facts. So the EU just 7 days ago, they made a significant update to the dual use list, which basically looks like they, so just comparing to what BIS has done, it looks like they basically have leveled up the dual use list to match what BIS has published over the last 2 years. So take from that what you will, but looks like the effort to have multilateral controls continues. Notwithstanding those challenges, and I think that was actually a very significant success of people working behind the scenes to get something like that done.
No, that's great, and I think that strikes me as it sounds like that was what the goal was in establishing these unilateral controls that essentially encouraged multilateral controls to be adopted, so that the licensing requirements would go away. I thought when it came out, I'd never seen anything like it before, but I assumed that was the desired effect, and it sounds like it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is another aspect where, I think from folks from our position, our vantage point, it frustrates us, because we do represent, more of the voice of industry. Ideally, you would get those multilateral controls and you say, now we can back off of these controls that are arguably way too broad, like basically the end use controls, end user end use controls. But politically, that's impossible. Maybe it's not impossible, but I'll say it's impossible, right? So politically, I just don't see a scenario in which, those controls are walked back. I think the best you can expect is a kind of awkward situation like what happened around the first big tranche of the Huawei restrictions, for example, where it's like this big set of restrictions and then a licensing regime, right? But as we all know, that can be fraught politically and practically with what things are allowed and what things are not, and what will the policy be. We might get to this later, but I think this is a really salient point to keep in mind right now, where we have whether it is or not, we have U.S.-China talks in Madrid right now, and I think we're sort of still in this cycle of a bilateral negotiation that's being influenced by a number of factors. But this idea that trade that export controls is now integrated with trade negotiations, I think is extremely significant for this reason, which is, if you do take an action that is justified for national security purposes, but also has the benefit of being leverage, in negotiations on unrelated issues, well, how do you ease off of that when you get what you want, right? And so, I think that has very significant implications for like, well, what actions are taken? How are they taken? Right? Are they taken with more, I would say like less publicized or precise mechanisms like letters or is-informed letters or specific company specific actions that I think are more flexible and like easier to I don't want to say like roll back, but like easier to adjust, if and when you decide that actually like overall the net benefit now outweighs the need for these controls, and so we can do that. But for industry, I think like it would be a big challenge if some of those actions are taken. They're never undone, but they're also never balanced with allies controls. So you never get to multilateral controls. And then you have a situation where basically industry is stuck. U.S. industry is stuck with significantly more restrictive controls that are not effective. And how do you navigate out of that?
Yeah, I mean, and two things. One is I wanted to kind of, for those of our listeners who are not kind of in the trade nerd category, can you, and I know Collmann, this is one of his favorite topics as well, talk a little bit more about these is-informed letters? Because I think what I'm hearing you say is it sounds like they're a tool by which you can have targeted export controls that can be rolled back in a way that is a lot more politically feasible, because you can just drop the information, whereas where you can withdraw them. Whereas once you put something into the Code of Federal Regulations, it becomes very hard to repeal it.
Yeah, so I'll give my former BIS colleagues an out and say this isn't necessarily about rolling back. I think the benefit of the is-informed process is you can go much broader than you would maybe need to. On purpose, because you're doing it in a highly controlled way, right? So it's very common I shouldn't say very common. It's very common in export controls, in modern export controls. Fundamentally, I think that the use of the is-informed process is you have a very urgent need. You apply the control, and then you have that conversation with the company or the industry or the market sector, and you say, "This is our concern. Now that we have your attention, work with us to figure out what is the right size control." Right. So I wouldn't necessarily see it as like rolling back. I think that's just fundamentally the nature of the is-informed process. It has other flexibilities, for example, where and actually it's worthwhile for like the practitioners on who are listening to focus on this. Like why would we need an is-informed process? What are we informing about, right? And so the key piece here is the knowledge-based controls. So we have a bunch of controls in the EAR that say if you know or have a reason to know, you can't do the following things. The is-informed letter is basically saying, we're giving you knowledge. We're giving you a reason to know. We're telling you. We're giving you the knowledge that you need. So forget about whether you have knowledge. You now have knowledge. So now you cannot do whatever it is in the regulations that we said you can't do if you have knowledge, of this event. And it's a central authority because the government often knows things that industry does not. And so it needs a way to say, you might not have known, or you will be forgiven for having not known that blah, 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 or we can't tell you what you don't know, but we're just we're going to give you knowledge, in this case, that what you're doing is supporting a WMDN use, or what you're doing is supporting, advanced semiconductor production and so on.
No, that's very helpful. Collmann, I know you love this is-informed letter. Explain to me why. Now, I have my thoughts too, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, I fear if I get too much into my love of is-informed letters, we'll derail this conversation and start talking about Russia. And just for background for the listeners who don't know, Chris and I were both at BIS together. Chris was the kind of guy who would go to Taiwan and come back with a picture of himself in a clean room in TSMC, and so that was kind of his area. I've been told what a semiconductor is multiple times. I'm still sort of working through it. And then my focus was different. My focus at BIS was Russia. And so, I would go to the Armenias and the Kazakhstans of the world, where they don't really have TSMCs or clean rooms. So you're getting a little bit of a different perspective from the two of us. But so I will just say briefly, in the Russia context, is-informed letters were hugely useful. They were useful, one, because we could get them out relatively quickly. Two, for exactly the sort of knowledge-based reasons that Chris flagged. We would often know that such and such a company was a diversion hub, and for reasons we couldn't tell or couldn't publish, we could then send the letter to the company and say, stop selling to XYZ company in India, Thailand, Malaysia, etc. And then three is that I am sort of the philosophy that once you put somebody on the entity list, the entity listing becomes useless because they just sort of set up a shell company. But if they don't know that they're on a sort of secret entity list, then it helps you sort of stay ahead of the bad guys. But anyway, this is maybe a whole different podcast.
A whole different.
I was going to say though, I mean, I know we wanted to talk a bit about this. Like, this would be a great segue, and I don't mean to steer it, but like, this is the neurons are firing on like some of the recent enforcement actions where I do think they're like. I think, and I should say, like, Collmann is being extremely humble about his role in all of that. I mean, just a brief perusal of the Federal Register notices. Yeah, unlike he did get his name in the Federal Register quite a number of times. So kudos for that. But I do think the agency learned so much. I think the agency, the law enforcement side of the House, and like the whole federal government, they learned so much. In coordination with allies and use of these tools through the Russia, like the Russia invasion saga, and I think these are all tools that they are bringing to bear. I mean, a lot of them are just fundamental capabilities of export enforcement, but I think this is like, you could bring all of these to bear on the chip diversion issue and other aspects of diversion that are highlighted. Just on Friday. I was a little bit surprised actually by this, and then I remembered that there were the Madrid talks. So there was an entity listing on Friday, and there were several entity listings in there that were about diversion, including one I have not seen before, which was diversion of tools actually to a restricted fab, which I thought was significant. But I think this is an area where a lot of those tools, a lot of those techniques, and concerns like supplier letters, red flag notices, and the like have been brought to bear and will continue to be brought to bear on the semiconductor issues.
Well. I was just going to jump in quickly. The reason that I like these is-informed letters, and it sounds like from a governmental perspective, there's the flexibility, there's the ability to essentially have what Collmann was talking about as kind of a secret entity list where the bad actor.
I'm going to get in trouble for that, but.
Pending investigation, BIS.
I think we have a title for this episode, though, right? The secret entity list. So what I like about them is that there's a lot of companies in industry that are trying to do the right thing, but they do not have sufficient information, and even with the red flag list, sufficient information to say we can't make this sale. And you do have a lot of internal pressure at a company, particularly from the compliance folks, to articulate why it is that we can't make this sale. And if you can't, you get a lot of pressure to make the sale. This takes all the pressure off. Now it's BIS has told us this is a bad company. We don't have to guess anymore. We don't have to see if we push the red flags, across the line. We now know. And so we know if we make the sale, people will go to jail. If we don't make the sale, we will be in compliance with export control law. It just makes things much easier. I know that you can't do it in every instance, but I know from a compliance perspective, these is-informed letters just kind of create clarity from where there was just all gray.
Yeah, I mean it's a very flexible tool, and again, I mean it should be obvious, but the drawback is obviously that you might miss someone, right? So like they really are most effective. Maybe they're only effective in cases where you know 100% of the suppliers, right, and you can reach 100% of the suppliers. Because if you can't, then that you really do need a published rule. You need, and like this is like, I mean, again, just a step back. So like. Everybody is always critical of each aspect of the rules, right? Like list-based controls are ineffective because you can design around the control language. End-use controls are ineffective because you could set up a shell company. the end use controls are ineffective because they require knowledge. But again, like when you step back, like this is fundamentally why all these things come together, and you have this sort of mesh of 4 or 5 essential tools. So I think like that will continue for sure. But yeah, the is-informed process also. I mean, it's like even though I can't think of one that was issued that was not eventually publicized, but it does have the advantage of being less politicized, and less targeted. So this is more like we're addressing an acute concern, and I would guess that like in those bilateral discussions and negotiations, no government, especially not ours, is going to have a problem saying like we're going to continue to take steps after acute problems that we see. And I think like the is-informed process is a way to address the most acute problems in a way that I think is very hard to criticize from like a political perspective. And so I do expect that we would see continued use of that.
All right. So before we get to your diversion point, Chris, because I want to put a pin in that because I do want to talk quite a bit about diversion. I want to talk about 2 other things with respect to kind of the new controls or newish controls on semiconductors and supercomputers. First are all these new license exceptions that came out. Any idea, and I'm throwing this out to the entire group, the kind of the thoughts behind these license exceptions and kind of where we're headed from here, because there seem to be a lot, and I sometimes have a hard time fitting them all together.
Yeah, I actually think a good way, I think you hit on just the right point. I think a good way to think about these is like maybe where are we going, right? So we had this, like we had a rescission without a formal rescission, but like we had a rescission. And so we're sort of stuck in this place where if you had a new license requirement established on January 15th, you don't have to comply with that. But the other stuff is still part of the Code of Federal Regulations. And so if there's something there that is, I think, beneficial or useful, or you think it's going to stick around, you might want to use it, right? And I think, for example, I know like companies were, they were still coming in with LPP notifications and, under these various license exceptions. There's license exception ACM, for example, we can talk about, which I think is extremely useful and is, I think, just reflective of the risk calculation. So fundamentally, I think what these are doing is they're trying to accomplish. So there was an AI action plan a month or so ago, and one of the key features there is we want to promote exports, but in a way where we're confident the end users or the purchasers, acquirers, and users of those items basically will use them in a way that's aligned with U.S. policy. Fundamentally, that's what I think these license exceptions were trying to accomplish. I think they did it in an extraordinarily complex way, but fundamentally, and this is, I say this because I think there's a lot of criticism of the rule, and like I get that from the sense of like we're restricting our closest allies from getting things that are quite important, and it's important for the industry. But I do think it would be quite a hard decision to say like, well, how far will you walk that back, right? Like if that worldwide license requirement on the chips is what was a big problem, like how do you walk that back? And so I think those license exceptions were really there. So you had a sort of suite of, so you had worldwide license requirement on the most advanced chips, and then you had these sort of carve outs, and they were either like individualized, national, or use based. And so you had license exceptions, for example, that would let you send, maybe certain less sensitive items or more sensitive items up to a cap, for certain highly trustworthy allies, for example. But then you had another suite of like broad blanket authorizations. So like there was like, the VEUs, for example, where you could say, an entire country or like a data center, for example, could be like a validated end user and essentially acquire items without having to get individual licenses. So like when you step back and you think of all these things, I think fundamentally what they were trying to do is strike that balance where we're saying like we want control, like we're not willing to accept like a just totally free free market or like free export unlicensed export framework. Because we do want to know that like this very significant, this very important asset will be used in a way that's consistent with the policy objectives. So I do think like we will probably see something like those that's trying to accomplish the same thing, right? Which is we want to have our at least our eyes on things. We want to have some way to direct traffic if after the sale we're unhappy with how they're being used. But at the same time, like it's very, very clear that the administration wants to promote more exports. So they want to promote diffusion, promote AI diffusion, and not have export controls get in the way of that. And we can talk about specific details along the way there.
Well, let me throw this over to Melissa to talk a little bit about kind of what is the deal with the AI diffusion rule. I know you were getting at it in part, Chris, but then and like what's going to happen now that it is kind of in limbo? The easy question I saved for you, Melissa.
Isn't this a crystal ball moment? No. Well, I think I could be wrong, but the most controversial part of the AI diffusion rule, besides just general complexity, was probably that the feeling some countries had of, I'm in this new tier, and what did I do to be put here? Like, why Switzerland? Am I the same as, pick a random country?
I thought we were friends.
Yes, exactly. I thought we were friends. Give me my candy back. No. So I think that was troubling in a lot of ways, understandably. Because it wasn't just, that we have a country list. There are many of those of different lengths and for different reasons throughout the EAR. But some of them are clearer than others about where they came from. But some of the other things that the rule was looking at are probably less controversial in terms of broad topics, but perhaps more it's less what they were trying to do and more how they actually ended up doing it. We know BIS has a history of complicated license exceptions. Hello, STA, even ENC. So the fact that these license exceptions were complicated, not really surprising. Again, it's a very complicated area. Maybe that's an area BIS will continue to improve on, and is creating these exceptions in a way where people understand them well enough to know that they actually are allowed to use them and how they can use them, and that they actually do make life easier. We also, under the diffusion rule, one of the things that didn't really change was, what's sometimes referred to as the tier 3 countries. China's been on that list from day one back in 2022. And then, we have the few other arms embargoed countries that are on that same list. But, I think one other thing that, if it wasn't entirely new in the rule, it was kind of newly highlighted, was kind of focusing more on the models and model weights. Again, that's a very, very detailed area that, unless you are working in this space, you may not ever think about. And some of that, again, the idea of controlling it perhaps less controversial than, again, which countries are controlled and why, or which countries can't use certain license exceptions and why, which is probably the correct framework for this rule. So it will be no shock if the new version of whatever the next version has a very different country list or lack thereof. Again, if all of the current license exceptions stay, I don't think it'll be much shock if there's some tweaks to, say, certification requirements or security requirements. Wearing one of my other hats. Yeah. It started looking like this is a CFIUS mitigation agreement, except for its export controls.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent point. I mean, I think one very simplistic way to think about what does a diffusion rewrite look like? It's exactly the same with no country list, right? It's just, instead of picking who gets what and where can go and who's trustworthy or not, it's just, if you want them, you have to do the following things. You have to agree to end user controls. You have to have security measures in place. if you want to get out of this, we have a not a country-based system, but like an individual, company-based system. If you want to get a lot of it. So like in that sense, yeah, like I do think you're onto something there. It's like one very simplistic way to think about it is, essentially the same policy outcome, but in a way that is less like discriminatory of like, well, some countries are good and bad. Because I also think that is like maybe not a practical way to think about like what the risks are. But yeah, I think you're onto something.
Actually, can I push back on all that on the prediction?
Let's hear it, Mr. Crystal Ball.
Well, so Tim and I, our previous episode, I think I got every prediction wrong. So we'll see what this
join the club.
Yeah.
I've been predicting for 5 years now that the U.S. was going to get back into the JCPOA. I think I've finally given up on that, but so it's going to be hard to top.
Yeah. I think when these rules were coming out, I think I agree with Chris wholeheartedly that there was sort of like a small number of suppliers. But I think the whole data center industry, it's just blown up after the 2 years. And I think a lot of the folks who are involved in that data center industry are just not as familiar with this complex world that we inhabit, are not as familiar with ECCNs, are not as familiar with the sort of terms and conditions of license exceptions, and have a really difficult time complying with this stuff, understandably. The number of times I've had to explain that NAC ACA kind of works for gamers, but not for data centers, which is not clearly written in the regulations. So I think if there's an eye to this sort of data center industry, I think we're going to have to do a significant amount of streamlining and simplification. What that looks like, I think that's the hard part. I think that may be what is making it difficult for those who are still in government drafting these rules. Because, how do you have what Chris says, which is, aligning this industry with U.S. foreign policy priorities, while still simplifying the rules to the extent that a non-manufacturer without a team of export compliance counsel can really comply.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the issue is that this is almost by definition kind of a cutting edge startup industry, and in any time you have a sector that is going through just an exponential growth phase, you have a bunch of people who are in it to kind of, you have the brokers and you have the distributors who are trying to kind of get into the game now because it looks like it's going to be huge, but who just don't have the resources to do the sort of complex compliance that we're talking about here. And I totally agree with you, Collmann, that is kind of the challenge, is that these rules, for export compliance professionals who've been doing this a long time are challenging for people who, couldn't spell export controls a year ago. They're just impossible.
Yeah, I would add here. I think there is well-meaning, but I'm not. But like I have I'm skeptical about implementation of this. I've said this. I think there's such a strong desire for like an easy button here, and so there's like, and so there's like, chip tracking, like we'll have kill switches, or we'll do chip, and and like I've talked through some of like by the time you get to the point in the supply chain where you would like have an effect, like you could even begin to talk about it having like an effective control on chip tracking, you have to have so much other regulatory infrastructure, and then like the challenge here is it's like the places you really need compliance the most are not actually the actors in the supply chain that are the most capable or like in the position to do it, right? I mean, it's like that's why it makes this problem set so hard. Is it's like you have, like Malaysian data center is just not in a position. I mean, maybe you could get them there, but like even in terms of just like resource spend, right? Like they are probably working on pretty fine margins, right? And so like even there, right? Like it'd be hard from like a just practical regulatory perspective to put like the brunt of compliance obligations there, right? And so I think like to the extent that problem that you described is solved, of like who and how and where. will require some creative thinking about like, where is it both like I would say like equitable and effective, to distribute controls, because I do think some of the ideas that are being floated, like I understand where they're coming from, but like they would require so much. They would require a lot of regulatory infrastructure that I think would be really challenging. Or if we had it, we wouldn't need chip tracking, right? If a lot of the things that you would need to make that regime effective, like if you just had that, I don't think you would need, you wouldn't need to have that as much. But maybe that's for another podcast.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because we are 1 point into the 5-point outline that we had coming into this podcast, and we are 54 minutes into recording. And so I think before we get to diversion, which I do want to talk about today, I want a commitment from the team to come back for part 2, because I think we've got it. This is not a topic that you can cover in one podcast. So let's plan on a part 2, and we can get to the rest of the outline. But for now, I know you had some thoughts about diversion, and diversion here, Chris, is really the motivator behind all of these rules, right? I mean, the issue in part was direct sales to China, but I think that the challenge was not controlling direct sales to China. If you have the controls and you have the jurisdiction, you can control direct sales relatively easy. It's diversion. It's sales to a third country that then get diverted to China. And so why don't you talk a little bit about diversion as a challenge and diversion as an enforcement issue?
Yeah, so I think of this, and again, this is where I think like the lessons learned from Collmann's part of the world here are like from Collmann's area of expertise are really interesting. I think like this is definitely more a Russia issue, but when you have things that can fit in a suitcase, like very naturally, you will, that will come up. So the way that I have like been thinking about this recently, we had a sidebar about like the May guidance. I do think that was like a very, very significant moment that I think industry got it. Like they perceived that it was as significant as it was. There was 3 guidance documents. One was on, can I have use AI chips that are subject to the AR, basically to train models for companies in D5 countries. I think that was the most the biggest firestorm was around that one. Because it's like, where really, I can't like train an AI model for a hospital in China. I mean, so that was like a very significant one. Then there was one on use of PRC designed AI chips, basically for any purpose. Basically the allegation was that they were significantly, if not all, were produced, potentially in violation of the AR, and so there were these, guidance restrictions on when you could use them. But then there was this third one on AI chip diversion, right? So this I think was the most complex of all of them. They had a number of really interesting red flags. That some of them were kind of classic, some of them were very novel. So, for example, like shipping to a country that doesn't even have the power grid to run these, right? Like there's no AI data center industry, or shipping to a company that is not a data center, and so there's a piece that I wanted to highlight because I just think it was overlooked. There was this enforcement action. It came out right after there was another, I will just say, another major enforcement action earlier this summer in July. And that one got all the press because I think it was more of like classic lessons learned, like dealing with parties on the entity list and, like red flags and managing knowledge in the company. But there was this other one about this company called ALX, and the caption for the case is USA versus Gang et al. And there's like, I think 3 defendants. What is interesting about this to me is that it looks like it was a sealed case, but somehow Law 360 got a copy of the full affidavit in support of the complaint. And when you read it, like if you read it closely, it actually is like, it reads like the May guidance. And so like I'm like I highly suspect that perhaps we were intended to, public was intended to see this affidavit. But so the fact pattern there, and this I think is like will help, launch out into discussion. The fact pattern is you have a 3-person company in the United States. set up 20 days after the October 7th rule in 2022. And basically, this company was purchasing advanced compute items like AI chip modules, servers, boards, etc., shipping them to intermediaries in Southeast Asia. I think Singapore and Malaysia were the two that were the focus of this affidavit. And the complaint focuses on this one shipment that looks like CBP detained a shipment. But there was like close to a dozen others, and so as you work through this affidavit, like you can just hear the special agent just saying like, time after time. And in my experience, this is normal. This is like a common thing to do. When this is a common diversion pathway or a common fact pattern. So it had a couple of interesting features, and I think like Collmann, you would say like probably every one of these probably also came up in the Russia context and in every diversion context. So just like some of the key bullets were like using EAR 99 right instead of the accurate classification, just saying like these are not the droids you're looking for kind of thing. Especially for items that are like publicly well known to be classified under stricter ECCNs. There was sales to companies that had no history, no infrastructure. There was basically no chance that they were actually going to use them. They were listing companies as the ultimate consignee who were ordinarily listed in expert manifest as intermediate consignees. So like the freight forwarder is probably not the end user of AI chip servers. There were, and so then there are these two pieces that I think like this is what I picked on, because I think like virtually all, if not all, of our clients and like the export industry, probably I feel like they overlook this because they don't consider themselves to like frequently get involved in criminal conspiracy to export smuggle chips, right? But you can see I feel like BIS is layering on these other aspects about like intermediaries and like perhaps trying to do what they were doing in the red flags by pointing out these other aspects. So like one of the key points was about like, when you look at the payment invoices, like there were payments from companies that didn't receive products, right? So like if there's a mismatch between the payer and the consignees, but then there was another one where like the invoices were describing products that don't exist, right? So it was like, there wasn't a suggestion that like the intermediaries did anything wrong here, but like you could sort of tell that they were trying to point out in the affidavit that like, just like a quick search, quick internet search, for example, I guess like what he was suggesting is like, did a quick internet search, or whoever the agent was, like quick internet search showed that like these are not actually products this company sells. Lo and behold, they had the same price as products the company does sell, that are restrictively controlled. And so anyway, I think this is like an interesting tidbit that I'm sure they were drafting. These transactions happened in April and May, so I'm highly, or like March, April. So I'm confident like whatever was happening when BIS was drafting the red flags, this was going on, and they were like, what's the problem set that we see? So I just think like from a expert practitioner's perspective, it was really interesting to see these two threads meet each other, and have this like kind of public example of what I think BIS is dealing with.
Probably not a coincidence that the red flags matched paragraph by paragraph the affidavit in the case.
Yeah.
Melissa and Collmann, for now, anything more on diversion? Because I think we're going to probably need to wrap up episode 1 here with that great summary of ALX from Chris.
No, I think that shows. We all have become a bit more of detectives as we're evaluating potential exports. BIS, especially at Update and other events, has given some hints of what it looks at. Like, is that a legitimate website? Here's how you can tell, or here's how you cannot tell. Go on Google Maps, check what the outside of the building looks like. Oh, look, it's somebody's flat in Hong Kong. So I think all of this is just warning everyone, but especially those startups, like employ some of your super skills in this area to save yourself from big trouble that could have been somewhat easily avoided.
Yeah, and it's very clear here that like whether they were not the targets, but like intermediaries were clearly involved, right? In terms of like, it seems clear that they were involved in like helping BIS get some of this evidence. and so for like from like folks who might be listening to this, like I think that's the takeaway. Is just like make sure you're prepared. Like you would like to have a very good answer if BIS asks for like, well, can you help us? Because I think like to the extent the intermediary industry, like financial institution industry, remains like the ally in those cases, like things will continue to be like smoother. But like you don't want to be caught flat-footed if somebody's like, well, did you not see, like, what did you see here? Or like, I don't know that they were asked those questions in this case. It's not clear, but I think that's the takeaway. It's just like, this is gonna keep happening.
Yeah. I might jump in, and I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to share two former what kind of Russian diversion techniques that we've now seen in the wild on the AI chip space. So I wonder if there's sort of like a Telegram chat where the Russian diverters are teaching the AI chip diverters how to do stuff. But
hopefully they're getting CLE at least.
Yeah. Exactly. And they can put it down as export control training.
Yeah, there is. I don't know if you saw this, Chris, but we all noticed that there's a new Export Compliance Daily noted that there's a new master's degree in sanctions that you can get from a university in St. Petersburg.
I saw that. I wondered if you were teaching.
But so one that we've just seen in the wild is a front company that gives itself a name that's sort of like similar to a legitimate person that might be buying these chips. So we saw this in the Russia context. It's, there's a bunch of East Asian companies out there that are doing legitimate business, and you just set up a 2-person company and you kind of give it a slightly different name, and then you kind of, download their vector logo, and then you send it over to your US suppliers and try to buy stuff, which is a difficult diversion tactic to spot. But it is possible if you do sort of ownership due diligence on your customers. And Chris, this is where the mismatch between the delivery and the payment can be super crucial. And then the other, I guess this is just a classic, is the shop set up in Dubai by 2 Russian nationals, which we saw a lot of. I'm sure it's still going on, getting chips into Russia's war machine, and it seems like it's now a tactic used in the AI space. Is you're shipping it to Russia, and then you look who owns it, and it's 2 Russian names with Russian phone numbers. And not to say, it's BIS does not have sort of individual based controls. There's nothing, inherently wrong with that. There's lots of Russian nationals who are involved in this space legitimately, but it's just a red flag you want to sort of think through before you sell $8 million worth of servers and have it get caught by customs.
Yes, it also helps to have Collmann's Russia spidey sense for diversion when it comes to these matters, because I think some of these things are in the wild that we've seen would be things that only Collmann would figure out, but he definitely figured them out and was onto them. But I think that for our listeners, that's probably where we're going to leave it. But I think the one of the lessons for today is that the kind of the growth of export controls and sanctions merging in this diversion space, because a lot of us have had experience with Iran diversion for many years, Russia diversion for 3 years, and now the AI diversion is kind of merging into that space, and all of the tools that you've used in the other diversion contexts are very helpful here, although we've seen some new techniques as well. So, well, thank you for coming on the show, Chris. Until next time, and Collmann and Melissa, thank you for talking about export controls.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, look forward to the next one.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone, and stay export controls compliant until the next time.
Produced by Heartcast Media.